Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Puppet Masters and Castle Freaks, the internet's leading all things Charles Band podcast. I am one of your hosts, Jared Hornbeck, a hot honey to the highest degree, and I'm coming to you from the salon of S&M. And in case any of you guys were wondering, what my co-host and I do in the privacy of our own studio is nobody's business but our own. And who is the co-host to which I am referring? To whom I am referring?
It is I, royal boner Steve Guntley, and this is the podcast all about corn dildos, butt gammon, and the elusive snapper. That's because this is the podcast about Cinderella and fairy tales, two very early Charles Band productions that were capitalizing on one of the briefest and weirdest film trends in all of cinematic history. I'm very excited to get into it. This is, of course, our very prestigious 69th episode. And, you know, Jared and I are gentlemen of class and distinction, but we just simply could not pass up the opportunity to talk about some dirty movies for the 69th episode. And we have a very exciting guest joining us to talk about this this cavalcade of filth. Who here is joining us today, Jared?
Yeah, it's so, you know, this is a cavalcade of filth is well put, because that's really what we're going to be covering here. And you know, it would make all of the sense in the world to cover two movies like this, to bring in one of the sort of elite horror movie experts in the United States, perhaps the world. I mean, he is a journalist and screenwriter, formerly the editor-in-chief of Fangoria, still contributing to the magazine, working for Rue Morgue, I believe, Vinegar Syndrome as well. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong about that, but I think I'm correct. Anyway, the one and only Michael Gingold is here to talk about these two movies of all movies. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Well, thank you for having me. And yeah, I've contributed Blu-ray extras to Vinegar Syndrome and Severin Films and Synapse Films and Arrow and most of the boutique labels.
Oh, love all of those. Yeah, we're very excited to have you. We've been wanting you on the show for quite a while.
Yeah, I condensed the intro. I condensed the intro because I felt like if I just listed accomplishments, that would take up our hour.
Well, thank you. And it is kind of odd to be on a show devoted to Band's non-horror films, or two of them.
It's weird. Yeah, it's a harder needle to thread there. There are fewer of those options to kind of go for. But I have to say you chose a couple of doozies here, because this is I love really obscure, really brief like film fads. And this is absolutely one of the strangest ones to ever emerge. I mean, this is a film fad that lasted maybe 3 years. But there's more than one movie capitalizing on it, and they were all pretty successful, which is insane to me. And we're gonna dig into that a little bit, but yeah, I'm excited to have you here. I've been regaled with stories of your trivia hosting and for a while now. I keep meaning to get out there to participate. I'm gonna have to do that one of these days.
Oh yes, almost every month at Rock Bar NYC in New York, me and Ted Gagan do live trivia, live horror trivia, final exam horror trivia.
It sounds right on my house. And, you know, not for the faint of heart kind of trivia, like some deep expert kind of stuff. So I'm excited to check that out sometime.
It is. Admittedly, it's expert level. We tend to do reasonably well, and also it's just a fun atmosphere. All the people playing. I mean, it's competitive in a friendly way. It's all, you know, people who know each other tangentially, industry people, just having a good time and showing off a little bit. And I will say that the last trivia. Michael, it was your round. Was your round the Charles Band round? Because you and Ted go back and forth. Doing rounds. So that was great because it was a Charles Band round. And if any listeners are wondering, yes, I, irrespective of the rest of my team, got 10 out of 10 on that round. It's really hard to not just accidentally know some of the stuff, even if it's a movie we haven't covered yet, just from all the research and reading that we've done on it. But so I see you almost every month at that, Michael, and it's always such an amazing event. And anybody in the New York area who likes horror and likes trivia, it's a must go to type event, and Rock Bar is a super fun place to go and check it out. But sorry, Michael, go ahead.
All right, just before we get off the subject, if you're interested, go to Facebook, Final Exam Horror Trivia. We have a page there where we update on when and where we're going to do it next.
Amazing.
Awesome. Yeah. And Michael, I wanted to ask you because, you have spent your career and the better portion of your life watching horror movies and B movies and exploitation movies and writing about them. And then, working, like you said, for all these like boutique companies in terms of like remastering and redistributing and getting some of these movies out there. So what I want to know is like your story comparatively with my Steve and myself and some of our guests is probably spans a greater period of time. So like, when did the horror bug bite you? Like, when did you really realize that this was something you were going to follow for your life, basically?
Well, I kind of came of age before the age of video, unlike most of the people I know. I feel like I'm kind of one of the older people in the fandom, at least among my circles, because I first started getting into horror around, I guess, 1979. Because at first the first thing I got into was Godzilla movies. Those were my first thing, Godzilla movies and big bug movies of the 50s and all that kind of thing. And then in 1978, I saw an ad in Starlog for a new magazine they were putting out called Fantastica that had Godzilla on the cover. And I said, well, I have to subscribe to this. And then I'm sure if the fans know the story, it got delayed for many months and finally emerged in 1979 as Fangoria. And right around the time that came out, I saw my first R-rated horror film in the theater, which was Phantasm. And then
I love Phantasm.
Yeah, and a little later in the year, I saw Alien and then Jaws for the first time on a re-release, and then Halloween on its first re-release, and that was the one that kind of set me on the path forever. And, kind of corresponded with the fact that, Fangoria started mostly as kind of a fantasy film magazine with occasional horror, and then slowly but surely, as it got into 1980, it began specializing in horror.
I wonder what movie could have spearheaded that hard pivot into.
Well, I know that the first issue, I believe, had a story on Dawn of the Dead, and that got a lot of positive response from the fans because there weren't really any horror magazines. There's Famous Monsters of Filmland, but they tend to concentrate on the harder core stuff. Though they did, I'll always remember, Famous Monsters did a big thing on Friday the 13th in an issue that went on sale a month before the movie came out, with a synopsis and photos that spoiled everything about the film.
I was thinking Friday the 13th and Savini might have been the Fangoria cover stories.
Yeah, Tom Savini definitely became kind of the first hero of the Fangoria generation. He had, Dawn and Friday and Maniac and all those films coming out around that time. So he was kind of a rock star and definitely one of the fans' favorites back in those times.
Yeah, we talked on another podcast about his work on The Prowler, which is really underrated, gross out gore stuff. But I'm curious, with all of your horror bona fides, why did you want to talk in particular about Cinderella and fairy tales?
Well, it's funny. I wasn't too familiar with fairy tales until we started discussing this, but Cinderella, that made quite an impression on me. I actually didn't see it until Exhumed Films, which is a group of people. They do lots and lots of screenings on the East Coast of 35 millimeter genre films. Every October, they have a 24-hour horror fest, and every spring, now it's in June, they do an X Fest, which is 12 hours of exploitation films. Excuse me, all on 35 millimeter. And at one of those fests, they showed Cinderella. And I think it was called The Other Cinderella because it was a British print.
Yeah.
And British prints, if you see a lot of print exhibitions, they often look a lot better than American prints. They don't turn pink and they don't degrade the way a lot of American prints do. And this print of Cinderella was gorgeous. It looked like it had been struck the day before. And, I thought, okay, this is going to be just some silly softcore thing. And it is a silly softcore thing. But it was actually a lot cleverer than I expected. And also Rainbow Smith in this film, to indulge the prurient interest a bit, is one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen in a film.
Yeah, she's really gorgeous. And it definitely pops. And this is just a deeply bizarre era of filmmaking that I'm so fascinated by. If we don't mind, I'd like to do a little table setting for what we're about to talk about, because for those who may not know, So in the early 70s, Charles Band shows up in LA. He's 22 years old. He's just starting out his career. He's looking for opportunities in the film industry. He's been working in the Italian film scene for a while with his dad, like ever since he was a kid. His dad was a producer and director on all these really low budget Hercules movies and things like that. But now he was ready to kind of strike out on his own. And one of the first connections that he made when he moved to America was a boisterous comedian and producer named Frank Ray Pirelli. Now, Pirelli he's one of those guys who's just kind of been hanging around the showbiz industry forever. He was a manager for Lenny Bruce and Shecky Green and a lot of like really huge comedians of the 60s. And it was through Pirelli that Band got to experience pretty much everything LA in the 70s had to offer. He tried sushi for the first time. He became friends with Barbra Streisand. He tried cocaine and didn't like it. And then he saw his first porno movie. Okay, it was 1972, and the porno movie he saw was Deep Throat. So let's take a quick step back to talk a little bit about Deep Throat in case anybody out there listening doesn't know. This is one of the weirdest pop cultural moments in U.S. history. It's a pornographic comedy that became a mainstream hit. This was a movie that was playing in like bijous in small towns for a little while because it was so buzzy. It was made over $100 million adjusted for inflation at the box office on a $40,000 budget. That made it one of the most profitable movies of all time. To this day, it's still one of the most profitable movies of all time. And it was this magnet for controversy, not just because of the content itself, but of course it became embroiled in the Watergate scandal a couple of years after this, with the informant who went by the code name Deep Throat, so it was this real flashpoint. And it launched a brief fad of porno chic, where we would see XXX films like Devil and Mrs. Jones and Behind the Green Door become actual like box office hits, Prior to this, like if you were seeing a porno movie, you were going to like a dingy little corner in Times Square and you were, wearing a big trench coat and looking around shiftily. At least I imagine that's what you were doing. I have no idea. But, from this sort of trend of XXX movies came a 1975 low budget comedy called Alice in Wonderland, which was an erotic musical that saw the titular characters loosening her sexual inhibitions through a series of otherworldly encounters. Now, that movie is really, really dumb. It looks like a high school theater production. It looks terrible, but it was a surprise box office smash. It made $90 million at the U.S. box office in both XXX and R-rated cuts, which is just insane. Have either of you seen this Alice in Wonderland movie?
Yeah, I have. It's funny. It was actually, you associate this kind of thing with the California film scene, but it was actually shot in upstate New York, not far from a drive-in where I sometimes go.
Oh, really? That's amazing. Yeah, it looks like it's so chintzy looking. It's kind of hilarious. Like it's like Halloween store quality costumes, and like, not that they're wearing the costumes for very long, but it's all deeply, deeply silly and weird. But it kind of launched this weird little trend. So let's jump back to Charles Band. In his autobiography, Charlie claims that he was not a fan of Deep Throat. And in fact, he doesn't really like pornography much at all, finds it kind of distasteful, which is ironic considering some of the prurient content that's in his movies. But that's
sure.
It's really always been more of a necessity of the industry than necessarily like a fetishistic thing for Charles Band. And I think that comes across, honestly. Like a lot of the times the movies the nudity in Full Moon and Empire movies is kind of perfunctory, it's just sort of there. And I think that's a lot of just Charles Band, like not being super interested in filming stuff like that. But like, it's the necessary tasks of the genre. But Band always had a good sense of trends. He always had a good idea of what was popular at the time. And so he agreed to make his film debut for Pirelli, a parody of the Marlon Brando art house film Last Tango in Paris, which was called Last Foxtrot in Burbank. Now, in his book, Band says that all copies of this are destroyed, and he considers that a good thing. So he'll be unhappy to learn that since then, the University of California has unearthed the copy. It's been restored. It is on the Full Moon streaming channel. So hopefully he's making a little bit of money about that. But
I can't wait until that and The Day the Clown Cried are in a double feature together.
I mean, you could argue at least The Last Foxtrot in Burbank is of some cultural significance, both because it's Charles Band's film debut and the editor on that movie was a scrappy young film student named John Carpenter. So, there's something there that you could say like, hey, Last Foxtrot in Burbank, it is culturally important. But that movie bombed really bad, but it did lead Band to meet some of his crew for what he considers his first quote unquote real movie, which is called Mansions of the Doomed. And the lead actor in Last Foxtrot in Burbank was a guy named Michael Pataki. He was a character actor with a pretty severe coke problem at the time, as Band described it. Very frenetic energy.
Anybody who's listening to this who doesn't know who Michael Pataki is, he is the guy who plays like Ivan Drago's manager in Rocky IV.
Is he really?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I did not put that together.
He's also got a ton of horror films on his resume. He starred opposite William Smith in Grave of the Vampire. He's in Ted Post's The Baby. He's in Dead and Buried. He's even in Halloween 4. I first noticed.
Oh, yeah, he's like an orderly.
He was a semi-regular on the Spider-Man TV series that was aired in the late 70s.
Right. Oh my God! Yeah, that's right. He was kind of a cop on that show, wasn't he?
Yeah, okay. He was. I think the lieutenant or something that Spider-Man kind of reported to, or was investigating the same crimes. But yeah, he's been in about 100 or so movies and TV shows. He's got one of those faces that keeps popping up in all these things.
Yeah, he can definitely play like a lot of cops and a lot of scuzzballs. Like those are his kind of two modes, which is good work if you can get it, because that means you're constantly employed.
And
but he
cartoon voices too, so he's done everything.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
As much as Charles Band would like you to think that Mansion of the Doomed was his first movie and Barry Last Foxtrot in Burbank, he was again capitalizing on a trend, which is obviously porno chic, which is not something that we've really hit on before. And before we go too much further, Steve, are there some like basic stats about this? About
yes,
Cinderella,
definitely.
we can fire off first.
Definitely we can do that first. So Cinderella was released in May of 1977, directed by Michael Pataki, and it was written by Frank Ray Pirelli, and it stars Rainbow Smith, Yana Nirvana, Marilyn Corwin, Jennifer Stace, Cy Richardson, Brett Smiley, and Frank Ray Pirelli in a small part here. So so the Pataki was brought in from Foxtrot to be the director of Mansions of the Doomed, and so he wound up directing the next couple of movies for Charles Band. Now, Mansions of the Doomed did end up making money enough to actually get Charles Band Productions, as it was known back then, off the ground, and so we would get movies like Tourist Trap and Laser Blast and things like that stemming out of the success of this movie. Now, Frank Pirelli, he acted as Band's partner and his advisor, and he believed in cashing in on trends as quickly and as cheaply as possible. So, when car chase movies started to become popular, like Death Race 2000, things like that, he had Charles Band make a car crash movie, and it was called Crash, and it was, I haven't seen it yet. We'll get to it. And then when that bizarre Alice in Wonderland movie hit, we got these movies. All right, so for Cinderella, Band brought in some of his usual players, Michael Pataki back again to direct, and Frank Pirelli wrote the script himself. Now, the movie had a budget of $400,000, which in 1977 is not nothing. Like that's a fairly modest budget for a indie production in 1977. And Band put some of the money towards lavish sets and costumes, and the gambit paid off. Cinderella was a pretty solid hit. It made money for everyone involved, except for Charles Band, because he'd gotten involved with a kind of shady financier who'd rigged up the contract to ensure that basically 100% of everything that movie made would go to him and not to Charles Band. And that was kind of a harsh early showbiz lesson for Charlie. And Pirelli recommended that in order to recoup his losses, he would have to make a second erotic fairy tale movie, which we will get to in a moment. But I think we need to talk about Cinderella first, because oh boy, what a wild experience this thing was. I think we could start with Rainbow Smith, right? I mean, it all starts with her.
She's, one of my favorite B movie actresses from the 70s, and also a very tragic story, which we'll get to. I first saw her, I guess, in late one night on TV when I was very young. I was watching horror films on late night TV before there was video, and I stumbled across one called Lamora, which is very Curse of Lamora, Lamora the Lady Vampire, Lamora, Child's Tale of the Supernatural. It's been under a bunch of different titles. But Cheryl Smith, who became Rainbow, starred in that when she was 15.
Mm.
And it's a very odd kind of Southern vampire movie. It's sometimes described as a lesbian vampire movie, but it's not quite that. It doesn't have the same, kind of connotations, obviously, because one of the actresses is only 15. But Rainbow Smith plays kind of the image of purity who might be corrupted by this other vampire woman. And then, of course, she wound up becoming kind of the sex pot when she got a little older.
Yeah, she definitely. We just talked about her. She has a very brief supporting role in the movie Parasite in 1982, in which she co-stars with Cherie Currie from The Runaways. And then Rainbow Smith would take over lead singer duties for The Runaways for like a year or two, right? Not very long.
She wasn't with them for very long, but she was definitely a part of them for a little while there.
Yeah, she was in that weird phase where both like Lita Ford was gone by that point too, and Joan Jett maybe was gone from The Runaways at that point. It was sort of like a weird version where there were almost like it was the same band in name, but no, or maybe one original member still kind of hanging out there. And then she also went on to do some other projects with Joan Jett down the line after that also, because she then got into this thing in the 80s where she was sort of balancing being an actress and musician at the same time and working on some movie soundtracks and such.
And sadly, around this time, she was also had some pretty severe substance abuse issues that wound up landing her in prison a couple of times, so her story ends pretty tragically, unfortunately. She died in 2002 at the age of 47 from complications from her various addictions. But she had a very sad life ultimately. But she really makes an impact here. She's very beautiful. She's very kind of charismatic. And I would say she's definitely the high point of this movie. I think she's giving this a little bit more I'm not going to say gravitas, but she's giving this a little bit more spirit than you might think a movie like this would get.
Well, I would go so far, Steve, as to say that I think this entire movie hinders on her performance. Like, I think if she's not good in this movie, or she's not relatable, or she's not magnetic enough, this doesn't work.
Yeah.
Like, she balances out. Like, there's sort of like a purity to her in her performance, in her look, that really counterbalances a lot of the smut, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And I feel like you need her in this movie for it to work. It's almost like, even though she's involved sometimes in some pretty, X-rated, or the funny thing about this is that, so we did an episode a while back, shout out to Aaron from the Manic Movie Monday podcast, on Beach Babes from Beyond and Beach Babes 2 Cave Girl Island.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about how they're softcore movies, but they're also attempting to kind of be comedies. And the first one is a little bit more successful than the second one. But it's like we found that like the softcore was softcore.
Yeah.
Like, this is softcore in the sense that they don't show penetration.
Right.
But aside from that,
They almost get there.
shocked.
They get very close.
I was shocked at some of what they did in this, some of the swings they took in this movie. Especially, I mean, I should have put two and two together that this came sort of right in the center of that porno chic trend. But I was like, okay, it's a comedy musical with some nudity in it. I was not prepared for the amount of nudity in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
B, the way the nudity is kind of played with, and the subject matter and kind of frankness of the songs. Not that I have a problem with them. I'm not a prude. I'm not a sex negative person. I was just surprised.
It is a big difference.
Yeah.
Because the Torchlight movies that we've watched so far have mostly been done by Dave Dakota, who's kind of shooting these sex scenes very kind of impartially. It's about as erotic as like bumping your Ninja Turtle figures together, but in this movie, you feel like it's being made. You feel like there are actual like leering, like Mad Magazine caricatures of perverts like behind the scenes, just like, oh yes.
Well, I think they're really skating on the edge of what you could get away with an X rating. It's like, how far can we push the R in this case?
Yeah. And I think most of the time with these movies, they did have like an R-rated cut and a triple X-rated cut that both kind of played in theaters. But as more and more parents groups started to protest the content, it was whittled down.
There sure is a difference between the R-rated cut and unrated cut of this movie because, so, not to get too inside baseball, but we've we planned this recording a while ago. We had to reschedule. So I went back and rewatched the movies again because I was like, let me be a little more fresh in our recording. So I had watched Cinderella the first time. Steve, you and I and Fairy Tales and had some conversations back and forth. And then I was kind of like, all right, well, I remember the conceit, but I don't remember specifics. Let me go back and watch it again. So I made the mistake of going on Prime Video to watch Cinderella. The cut that is on Prime Video is an R-rated cut that is 19 minutes shorter.
Wow.
Than
this
the
is not a
version-
long movie. This is not a long movie.
Than the version that's on the Full Moon streaming app. That is I think that's even an extended cut by a few minutes, but it's 94 minutes and it's an unrated cut, I believe. The R-rated cut was an hour and 15 minutes. And I was like watching it and I didn't notice the runtime at first. And I went, this feels way more tame. Like, did I just get used to it? Like, having watched this and Fairy Tales back to back, like, was I initially shocked kind of by nothing? And then I look at the runtime and I'm like, something is not right here. So I went back on the Full Moon app, opened Cinderella up, saw that it was a 94-minute cut, started watching that version. And then there's a scene that happens kind of early on that is completely omitted from the other one. And I went, oh yeah, this happened. And so then I watched that one for the remainder of the time, but it is a jarring difference. I mean, any sort of like girl on girl type stuff, especially if there's frontal, is completely gone from the Prime Video cut, which I don't want to get, I'll get down from my soapbox in a second here, but we've been talking about the importance of physical media, and just like everyone else, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I was singing the praises of streaming and being like, I don't need to hold on to these jewel cases anymore. I don't need to hold on to these discs. I don't need these things anymore. It's all going to be available. And now what I'm noticing happening is that more and more stuff is just disappearing. Yeah. Or the versions of it that are available are not the versions that were intended to be seen, or the versions that you maybe grew up watching. And so now I'm like, man,
Tubi's trimming out like objectionable content. Yeah, it's about like I good news, listeners. I have the Blu-ray of Cinderella. I can preserve it for all time. So when the bombs drop, don't worry. I've got an archived copy of Cinderella 1977 to preserve for future generations to learn from.
When the whole internet shuts down and we lose everything that's on streaming, we'll still have our discs. And actually, while we're on that subject, a funny story about Cinderella. So I'd seen the movie. I don't remember how extreme the British cut was. I would assume that being Brits, they probably trimmed it down somewhat.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was the first time I saw it. And then I was at a Monster Mania convention and I went to the Full Moon table and I was talking to a friend of mine who worked there. And I think they had just put out Mansion of the Doomed and Crash on DVD at the time. They kind of rescued them from the vaults. And I said, you have these, but it's a shame you don't have Cinderella because I really like that film. And he said, oh, well, we have a box of those, but, this is a horror convention. We weren't sure how these were going to sell. So this is on like the Friday evening. I think midway through the next day, Saturday, I went back to the table and he said, thank you so much for mentioning Cinderella. We put them out. We are already sold out of them.
Amazing. I mean,
apparently it had a lot more fans than me, and they all wanted a copy.
It definitely sticks in your mind. I mean, I don't know about y'all's reaction to kind of revisiting this or visiting it for the first time. I feel like my jaw was just dropped the entire movie. There's sometimes you look at a movie from like the 60s or the 70s and you can still see like recognizable threads of what our world today and what we've become. Cinderella and Fairy Tales, looking at these movies feels like peeking into an alternate reality. This feels like something that couldn't have actually happened. It's so deeply bizarre. I have a little bit of affection for this movie just because it is so weird. It is kind of funny in a lot of places. I think it has kind of like a burlesque hall sort of attitude about it, which is also why Cheryl Smith sort of stands out in this movie, because everybody else is doing like this broad body caricature and she's playing it fairly straight.
Yeah, she's very appealing and natural in it.
Yeah.
However, I will dispute that she is the sole highlight of the film.
Oh, no.
Now, unfortunately, talking about one of my other favorite actors gets us into somewhat problematic territory because Cinderella marked the film debut of an actor named Cy Richardson.
Yeah.
And, this was his first film, and he plays the fairy godmother with the caricature that implies. In fact, now that I think about it, I remember when I was a kid going out to the movies with my parents, and we actually passed by a poster for Cinderella because it was funny. This theater, the suburban theater, which is where we saw lots of family films and comedies, and where I later saw a lot of horror films, would also play adult films every so often. And so they had the poster for Cinderella up, and they had a picture of the fairy godmother. And I remember people seeing that in the lobby and laughing. So obviously this is not a politically correct character at all. However, Cy Richardson is really funny in it, and his song is actually very clever. His character is also a thief.
Yeah.
And he has a song called Grab It. That's kind of his introductory song.
Mm-hmm.
And where's the lyric? I think it is, as soon as I heard the lyric, at every other trade I'm inept, so I guess I'll spend my days as a klepto. That's when I fell in love with this film.
There are I was surprised at the cleverness of the lyrics of the songs, especially like having seen the Alice in Wonderland musical and just like, oh, these are just nothing. These are just like cooked up nonsense.
Yeah.
Yeah. These have some clever lyrics to them. You can tell that Frank Pirelli comes from a comedy background. It does have that very it's got kind of like a Catskills sort of vibe to it, like an old school,
well, the people
style.
who are behind the songs should get credit. Lee Aries and Andrew Belling. And they wrote the music and lyrics to all the songs. And I think the songs are okay. Good is not a descriptor I want to throw out, because I think good I find with musicals, the best songs from musicals transcend the subject matter of the musical and could work in the context of that's say what you will about Grease. Grease is a pretty terrible story with some pretty bad sexual politics that really didn't age well, but You're the One That I Want can be played on the radio, and you don't need the context of Grease to tap your toes to that song. And Hopelessly Devoted to You, Olivia Newton-John just belts it out, and it's these are good songs irrespective of the musical. I feel like these work within the context of the musical, but I think they're catchy, I think they're memorable, and this movie had this thing that doesn't happen very often, which my reaction as the movie was going on was recognizing that it's a musical, which means there's going to be musical numbers. And they would introduce a motif or an idea, and all of a sudden music would start. And in my brain, I would go, oh, they're not going to have a song about this. They're not going to do this. This is not going to be a song. And then it was. And then it was somehow balanced to be sort of innocuous and catchy and good-natured enough, even though it was about either thievery or sexual exploits, to where you could get behind it, because it was sort of, I don't know, even though it's exploitation, it wasn't that problematic, all told. Full disclosure, I had a lot of fun with Cinderella, and actually watching it the second time, when I picked my jaw off the floor, like Steve had mentioned, there were things about it I started to pick out where I was like, this movie works. It's trying to juggle a lot of things at once. It's trying to do comedy. It's trying to do eroticism. It's trying to tell a story. It's trying to be a musical. And it somehow manages to be non-offensive. And I want to also point out, you brought up Cy Richardson, who I thought was a blast in this movie.
Yeah.
Just having a great time. I really liked Kirk Scott as Lord Chamberlain.
Oh,
I thought I thought I was above a pratfall. Apparently I'm not, because I laughed so hard when he falls off the horse and rolls down the hill. Like, I don't know if it was just an unexpected fall. Some of them are pretty easily telegraphed, but like that one got me. But I just think there's a sort of like fake mustache twirling energy that he brings to that role, which was fun. And that's I think what I liked so much about this movie is that they're doing a really specific thing and everyone seems super game. Like everyone's on board.
Yeah, for sure. Everyone's really well. I also want to point out Cy Richardson, out of this cast, probably went on to the biggest career. He did about 100 other movies and TV shows, including I think 5 or 6 for Alex Cox. He's in Repo Man, Sid and Nancy, Walker. He's done award-winning stage work. And I didn't realize
he wrote the movie Posse. Yeah, the Melvin Van Peebles Western movie. Yeah, he wrote. That movie.
Yeah. And you could also see him. He's in Fairy Tales also. He doesn't have quite as good a part, and I don't think he has his own song in Fairy Tales, which I think was a big mistake.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, I mean, he had it's a really dynamic kind of, you can tell he's really into it and like, this is my big break and I'm going to make the most of it, even if it is in this kind of smutty, silly movie.
It's an interesting dynamic too with the songs, like you were mentioning, because most of them are these kind of like bawdy, silly, dirty songs. But then you get Cinderella's opening number, which is, in musical parlance, it's the I Want song, right? It's Ariel, like, under the sea and everything like that. Yeah, exactly. And she's singing the song that's pretty straight and normal. And the only difference is that her clothes are literally falling off her as she sings, and not in a stripteasy way, in a, oh shit, I didn't fasten my belt tight enough and I don't notice that my clothes are falling off. It's so weird the way that she plays that, and is just singing it very sincerely with no real jokes to it.
She has a lovely voice too.
She does.
I don't think she did any other musical work other than this.
Yeah, no, I don't believe so. Outside of the Runaways, yeah, but
well, in movies, I mean.
Yeah. No, and I don't know. I was very thrown and confused by a lot of the stuff that was happening in this movie. Not like confused, like I didn't follow it, just sort of like marveling at the decisions, marveling at all the different things that came together to make this movie. I am still not 100% clear what a snapper is, and I don't think I really want to dig deeper into that.
A discussion of snappers in this movie. Frank really can tell us, maybe.
Yeah, you might be able to. I imagine it's something to do with like Kegels or something, but I'm not.
Yeah, similar. It's an old sort of parlance for the work that a woman can do with her vagina during sex, and it dates back to, I think, like the 1920s.
Yeah.
But so they're using it in like medieval times here, which seems to be anachronistic, but people who are sitting in the theater for Cinderella clearly are there to point out these kinds of contrivances.
Yes.
And there's just such a gross sound effect when it's being employed. And it's clearly just somebody like doing ADR, like, I don't know, like shoving their fingers into a mayonnaise jar or something. It's so gross.
Speaking of gross, we get huge, bombastic, over-the-top performances by Yana Nirvana and Marilyn Corwin and Jennifer Stace as the stepmother, but the two prior as the stepsisters, Drusilla and Marbella. And they were going for it. And I'll tell you, like, their introduction in the movie, I was kind of like, they're just saying like, oh, Cinderella, you're going to do our work. You're going to please like iron our dresses for us, while they take them off and throw them at her. And then it's like, oh, okay, so they're naked. That's sort of this way that they're being exploited here. And there is no logical way that your brain then goes to song about them telling the prince or someone to do it to them, that culminates in the corncob dildos.
Oh God, I forgot about the corncob dildos. I even said it at the beginning of the show. I forgot about them. Oh, there's so many things that you can just sort of like. It's one of those like, all right, this is too insane. I'm going to file this away and I'm going to come back to it later. But Yeah.
That was one of the moments where my jaw was on the floor because I was like, I can't believe they're doing that. And the fact that it's Cinderella, the poor sister, who's sitting there pedaling this machine that's
Oh yeah, that
operating
weird
them is. So, Michael, since you saw this, like you said, at a festival, I'm really curious because as I watched it this second time, there are moments in the movie where I was like, all right, well, I already saw this, so I'm not reacting fresh to it. But I started to wonder, you know, is this, I mean, you think of even a softcore pornographic movie as being obviously like an individual thing. Like this is the kind of thing you want to watch when you're alone, or at least if it was more hardcore than it is. But it seems like there's a lot of what could have been really good audience moments. So like, do you remember sort of the reaction of people around you seeing it in a theater with other people? Because it's like, it's obviously playing to different beats than like a straightforward hardcore porn would be, because people there obviously are trying not to be seen with their reactions or how they're, taking the movie in and how that what they're doing to the movie. Here, you're just kind of like watching and maybe reacting. Do you remember like moments in the movie that played well to a crowd?
Oh, I think people, especially when the songs came up, I think people were surprised that, I mean, I'm not sure how many people knew the movie before we saw it or knew that it was a musical. And then when the songs came up, I remember people were kind of like, this is really fun. This is clever and witty and, better or different than we might have expected.
Yeah, I think there's some subversion there. And I think I had the same reaction. My initial reaction was sort of shock, but then it was like, okay, but no, but they're really this particular niche that they're trying to hit. They're doing it, I think, about as well as you can.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this was quite a while ago. I believe it was the last movie of the night. I think at X-Fest when they show X-rated stuff, like they showed Gums once also, and it's always the last movie of the night. But I think people were into it, as I recall. People were laughing and kind of having a good time with it. Speaking of the sisters, I have to bring this up. I found an old review of Cinderella from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in 1977. Hang on. And it's a very negative review. I mean, it says it makes the recent X-rated Alice in Wonderland look like a masterpiece by comparison, which I certainly don't agree with.
Yeah, I'll go the opposite way on that one. Yeah,
other way around. But then it's a very short review, and it then says director Michael Pataki doesn't even have an attractive cast to work with. The stepsisters look like Joel Grey in Cabaret, and the prince looks like Beck Reed. Hardly the sort of cast conducive to an erotic evening.
I mean, I think they're missing the point of casting the ugly stepsisters there. Like,
so too.
Those two are basically drag performances. Yeah.
It is funny to look up, old reviews. People would actually review X-rated movies on occasion. And I think I have another one here. Hang on. It's a San Francisco Examiner review, which was a little more positive. It says, the performers aren't too accomplished, though one stands out for his outrageous camp comedy. Cy Richardson is quite funny in the role of the fairy godmother.
Yeah, some positive there.
Yeah.
But they also mentioned the stepsisters. They said they are grotesque and tiresome nags. One is made up to look like Bette Midler, the other like David Bowie.
Again, not entirely wrong, but I think by design for a reason.
Oh, and another thing, at the end it says, the last line of this review says, however, Joseph Mangin's photography is exceptional and more artful than is customary in the porno field. And it's kind of interesting to point out these two movies were shot by DPs who are usually associated with the horror genre.
Yeah.
Because Joseph Mangin shot Alligator and Nightmare on Elm Street, Alone in the Dark, and a bunch of other things. And Fairy Tales was shot by Daniel Pearl, who shot Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Oh, wow. I mean, these do look nice, or at least I'm going to say Cinderella looks nice.
Films. Yeah, and it's just interesting that, they're very bright and colorful. There's not a lot of, darkness and shadow play or whatever in them. And, but yeah, those DPs wound up becoming much better known for horror films.
That's crazy. I mean, I think I was struggling so much with just kind of the disconnect of why this movie exists and why both of these exist, really, because it's on its face, it's kind of a very childlike sort of setting to be making like this sort of corrupt little twist to it, and I'm just like, there's a tonal disconnect that I was like struggling to wrap my head around, and I just had to kind of go with it and just be like, this is the era, and this is kind of the weird thing that they've zeroed in on.
Oh, and by the way, I was mistaken. Mangine did not shoot Nightmare on Elm Street, but he did shoot Mother's Day and Sword and the Sorcerer and Exterminator.
Yeah. You now that you say that, it's Jacques Hayton did.
Nightmare on Elm Street, Hayton shot those. But yeah, there's nothing else on Mangine's resume like Cinderella. So
yeah,
I mean, and everybo's got to start somewhere.
We didn't talk much about Brett Smiley, and I find the like Prince Valium energy that he kind of brings to the role is kind of funny. And there's not a whole lot to that performance really, but I will say that luckily him and Cheryl Smith were childhood friends allegedly. And so doing those scenes was very comfortable for both of them, which is nice to know that there was no unpleasantness or they didn't need, intimacy coordinator or something.
Brett Smiley seems interesting. Yeah, Brett Smiley seems interesting from reading up on him. I was not familiar with him, but I guess he was kind of like an also ran like glam rocker who got pretty big in the UK despite being an American kid. But yeah, he had a little bit of a musical career, and is a well known. Like there are some documentaries about him, So it's he had a small career, but it was impactful, which is interesting. I was not familiar with him.
Cool, yeah, I didn't really know that either. And I want to point out before we transition into fairy tales, I want to point out just like one thing. Like some of the stuff is really broad, obviously, and silly, but I went with it and had a smile on my face. And even things where it's like you were saying before, Steve, like how this is such a product of an era. The gag where the sort of like royal band that's playing like a medieval waltz, like the dancers line up to dance, and then all of a sudden it breaks into like the hustle.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. It made me laugh. Like it's silly and it's, of its time. Because that's the other thing too, is it's watching this thing almost 50 years removed from it. It's like you have to put yourself in the situation of like what it would be to the audience in 1977. So it would have been this medieval waltz then turning into a modern song or modern trend. So like it's weird watching it now because it's like one old trend to another old trend, but it's like it would have obviously played a lot different than for it to be something modern. It would just be like if like a band was playing some kind of medieval waltz and all of a sudden went into like an auto tune like R&B or hip hop song. It would just be very jarring, which is probably what it was to those audiences. Michael, you had mentioned you wanted to do Cinderella for the show, and so my final question that I have about the movie is, which watch list do you think you're higher on, FBI or CIA?
I don't know. I mean, there's nothing illegal going on in this movie. I mean, it's a dirty movie from the 70s. And I don't like to call it dirty because there's something kind of innocent about it almost when you compare it with a lot of the other porn from that time.
Yeah. Even when you compare it to fairy tales, I would argue, which has a little bit of a meaner edge to it.
And I also wanted to point out it kind of existed, this whole mini trend of these X-rated musical comedies, or also these X-rated sketch comedies, like If You Don't Stop It, You'll Go Blind, and Jokes My Folks Never Told Me. All like really cheesy, dirty jokes kind of played out by actors, and it was the same kind of corny stuff that you see in these musical films.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That was another weird little trend too. Those ones are kind of lost to time a little bit too.
So and I think Robin Williams was involved in one of them. I think he's in If You Don't Stop It, You'll Go Blind. I'd have to look that up. But,
what was wasn't there like an X-rated like cartoon that like Bill Murray and John Belushi did voices for?
Oh, well, there was a French Tarzan spoof.
That's it.
That was reissued. Oh, what was the name of it? Shame of the Jungle, I think it was called.
Shame of the Jungle. That's it. Yeah. That's a very strange one to try and track down. I think I saw that years ago, but yeah.
And then there was the first nudie musical, which was a little more mainstream. And again, like Alice in Wonderland, I don't think nearly as entertaining as Cinderella is.
No, I agree. I think First Nudie Musical is almost trying to comment a little bit on this very particular weird trend that's going on, but I don't think it's quite as successful in its execution, probably because it just doesn't really go for it the way that Cinderella does.
I think we all feel Cinderella is pretty effective in what it's trying to accomplish, which brings us to fairy tales. So,
Let's
Steve,
talk
why
about
don't you rattle
fairy
off some
tales.
stats about fairy tales?
Absolutely. It was released in August of 1978. It's directed by Harry Hurwitz, who's credited here as Harry Tampa, and it's written by Frank Ray Pirelli and Charles Band. And it stars Don Sparks, Cy Richardson, Brenda Fogarty, Martha Reeves, Professor Irwin Corey, Robert Harris, Simi Bo, Nye Bonet, and Linnea Quigley, the very first ever Linnea Quigley appearance. She plays the dream girl at the end of this movie, spends most of her time being totally nude, which was kind of a forecast for her career as it would go forward. She's
out of character.
She's proven to be one of the most comfortable in the buff actresses of our lifetime, at least. And this is kind of where it all started. I think she's talked a little bit about her experience on this set and just being kind of like baffled by it. She said she felt very comfortable, but had she had a little bit more experience and known what it was like on movie sets, she would have asked for a closed set. The way it was done here was just kind of everybody sort of gathered around and leering. And I think most of the time when nude scenes now are shot, it's usually just a handful of trusted people.
Oh, definitely closed set. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, but she said she had a positive experience. Obviously, she would continue to work with Charles Band several more times over the years. But yeah, this is a very strange movie. Again, going for the same kind of vibe, following up on the same energy of a musical fairy tale. But this one is not one specific fairy tale like Cinderella. It's kind of running the gamut and sort of poking fun at a little bit of everything. It is an oddly talky movie. It's an oddly man-forward movie for the kind of audience that they're appealing to. It's a lot of like
right from the beginning. It's like the prince in bed, and then Dr. Eyes, Dr. Ears, and Dr. Mustachio.
Yeah.
None of whom have a mustache, by the way.
Not one.
So how he ended up with that name, I don't really understand. But
it's like people had mustaches by accident. Like you couldn't avoid them.
Right. And it just starts off and it's like, man, we're in, a faraway land, once upon a time, somewhere nondescript, but apparently by what we're hearing and seeing, we're in the Catskills because these are like Borscht Belt comedians doing like a Henny Youngman bit. And a lot of them are Brooklynites, and definitely made their bones, I'm sure, in like the early New York comedy scene 50 years earlier.
Well, especially the guy standing outside, the old woman who lives in a shoe has a big shoe, which is a brothel where most of the movie takes place. And there's that guy who kind of mans the door and just goes on this incessant shtick.
Constantly. I wrote in my notes, this movie is really going to appeal to you if your fetish is bad vaudeville routines.
Exactly.
There's a lot of that. There's something about this movie that seems dedicated to undermining any sort of erotic thrill you might take out of this, because even when like they'll start showing some scenes that are like fair, it's like, okay, things are warming up, things are getting kind of sexy, and then you need to cut to this really gross old man hunched over the keyhole masturbating.
Keeping calm.
Yeah, they have to keep cutting it with these like really gross like visual jokes, and I'm just like, all right, so what are we trying to do here? What are we trying to accomplish? Because like,
yeah, there's an ick factor to this one. It's almost like every song in this one is akin to like the landlord's daughter song in The Wicker Man.
yeah, exactly. They're all they all have that kind of quality. There is a funny story that Band tells in his autobiography.
This is the best thing about the whole movie, I think, is what makes the movie most interesting is this part.
Yeah, it specifically relates to the boot. The like you mentioned, Michael, the most of the movie takes place in the shoe. The old lady who lives in a shoe now runs a brothel out of it. And they needed to build a 45-foot tall boot for the exterior shots of this. And it's a very flimsy looking kind of paper mache almost looking boot. It doesn't really look like it's the peak of craftsmanship, but they built it. It's very large. And they transported it semi-illegally to Griffith Park in Los Angeles, which if you've if you're familiar with Griffith Park, it's very big. It's very populated. You know, that's where kind of a lot of the major landmarks of Los Angeles is in Griffith Park. And naturally, they didn't really have any filming permits to be making this movie. They didn't really have any permits to be putting this giant boot out in the woods. But they managed to work the crowd by turning it into an attraction. So while people were out there filming the exterior shots of these boots, they did it all in one day. Crowds would gather. And so Charles Band would go up and offer them snacks and say, hey, do you want to watch us film a movie? You know, this is going to be a real cool. He treated it like it's a tourist attraction. And so people got to watch them filming this really goofy movie. They had no idea what was actually being made, but they sat around the park and they watched it. And then it had a nice day of shooting, and nobody called the cops. And then at the end of the day, they finished all their shoot. They're breaking down the sets, and then they realize, we have no idea what to do with this boot. Like, we can't transport it out of here the way we came in. Like, we can't really break it down. And so their response was like almost in a cartoonish way. They just ran. They just fucking ran away. They left this boot sitting there. And for a few weeks, this boot became a bit of a weird LA landmark. People were talking about the Griffith Park boot. Have you gone out to see the boot yet? What's going on with the boot? Everybody was talking about it at parties. And finally, Charles Band, a few weeks later, went out to visit it, and it was gone. Like the city had broken it down, or vandals had taken it apart. Some reason it had been finally broken down. But for a couple of weeks, the boot was kind of like the set of Intolerance, you know, in LA, like this big monolithic thing left over from a film set past that just became part of the firmament of LA for a brief little moment. So I thought that was a funny little legacy. I wish somebody had preserved it. I wish somebody had taken it upon themselves to, like, that's right, this is the boot from 1978's Fairy Tales.
Right next to the cane from Citizen Kane.
Yeah. Wait a minute. Yeah.
It's funny though, you talk about it being man forward. There's an awful lot of subtext in this movie. I mean,
there is.
We open up with the prince in bed with a woman, and he literally says, I'm sorry, I'm just not interested. Yeah. And you meet Jack and Jill, and Jack is more interested in the prince than in Jill. And then when you get into the brothel, there's a room that Snow White shares with the 7 dwarves. And the prince goes in there to ostensibly have sex with Snow White. Then cut to later, he comes out, and they carry a couple of the dwarves out unconscious. Ooh. And it's like, it's not even subtext. It becomes text, I think.
That was the scene, the Snow White moment I have in my notes. I wrote, the Snow White sequence is where this movie needs to go to jail. This movie is illegal now. Everybody goes to jail. Everyone involved in this movie needs to go to jail. That was so bad. It's this horrible little sequence of her like singing about all the dwarves that she's having sex with. In the meantime, in the background are
my world.
There's 7 little people actors who look zonked out of their mind on Quaaludes, just like trying to get through the day. And I'm just like, I feel so bad for everybody involved in this scene.
And they're all these little like red and blue pajamas. It's weird.
Yeah. Well, they had sets left over from Santa Claus Conquers the Martians, you know, so I'm sure they just kind of dusted those off. Yeah.
There's a weird like dance number with people in bondage where they're like chained up against the wall and trying, kind of doing a musical number. It's weird.
That one I thought was a little funny. Yeah. That, there are moments, there are a couple of songs here that are funny, there are a couple of lines here that are funny, but I definitely felt that this one was lesser than Cinderella. It feels a little more mean-spirited. It feels a little more just kind of casually cruel and sort of aggressively stupid, and it just was really trying to undermine any kind of like erotic thrill you could get out of the movie, which was a bizarre choice when that's sort of the whole thing you're selling the movie on.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, this isn't a sequel to Cinderella, but it kind of abides by the laws of sequels, which I feel like in some ways it tries to go bigger, which is to its detriment, but it also feels like it's trying to capitalize and catch lightning in a bottle again. I feel like all of the ingredients worked to create something that was surprisingly tasty in Cinderella. And here it's like the addition of all of these things, but at the same time, it's like they're trying to just kind of like, I feel like that one of the things in Cinderella is that I felt like the songs were all sort of different genres. And here, for fairy tales, like it feels like every song comes in and it's just like a dun 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 dun, like a oompa song with people singing along to it, and it's Lee Aries and Andrew Belling again doing the lyrics and the music, but something is lacking in this one. I don't know if it was just like, well, it worked the first time, let's do it again. And I think, you mentioned before how this one is not just Cinderella, it's a bunch of fairy tales. I think that works to its detriment, because I think the strength of the movie was the plight of Cinderella and the performance of Cheryl Smith, or Rainbow Smith, in the first movie. And you don't really have that in this movie, because now the focal point of this movie is Don Sparks as the prince. And no offense to Don Sparks, but I really don't want to look at him for the duration of the movie. When the last movie gave us Rainbow Smith and this movie gives us Don Sparks. And yeah, again, no disrespect. He's another one of those guys like Cy Richardson who has just never stopped working. And he's very successful on Broadway and is just kind of in everything. But yeah, I think he's funny enough in this, but we're following like kind of a neurotic prince with impotence for most of the movie.
A passive character. That's the problem.
Yeah, very passive, very kind of milk toast. One other insane casting I do want to mention here is Martha Reeves is in this movie. Yeah. Now, Martha Reeves, if you don't know that name, you might know her band Martha and the Vandellas. They're the iconic girl group of the 50s and 60s. It's Dancing in the Street. It's Jimmy Mack. It's Nowhere to Run. A bunch of like classic girl group songs. Allegedly, I don't know, this is IMDb trivia, so I don't know how reliable this is, but allegedly she did not know she was making a dirty movie until she took her church group to go see the film. That's the rumor that about that. I'm not sure how true that is, but that is a pretty funny idea if that's true.
She pulled the old Morgan Fairchild, huh? Of Test Tube Teens from the year 2000. I'm sorry. Like, I find it, I mean, maybe to what degree the smuttiness would be, but I feel like given the context of the songs and even what was being shot around her, she had to have some idea.
Yeah, you had to have, I don't know. Sometimes they just give you sides, or they might just tell you like, okay, this is the script for your scene. And maybe it's like a bit of a ribald sort of comedy take on a fairy tale, but without knowing necessarily that there's going to be a lot of nudity and sex in it. But,
yes, and sing this completely innocuous song, "You'll Feel the Magic in Me."
Right.
Exactly. And talking about the actresses, I want to point out also there's another kind of tragic story in the cast. Angela Ames, who plays Little Bo Peep. She went on to do a whole bunch of other movies, usually in small parts. She's kind of like little sexy bit parts in movies and TV. One of the ones people might remember the most is in Bachelor Party. She's in the beginning where Adrienne Zemed is the photographer, and she comes in with her little baby, and Adrienne Zemed winds up taking a bunch of pictures of her boobs.
Oh, I've never seen that movie. I don't know. Maybe I should. Should I see Bachelor Party?
I mean, it's again not politically correct, but it's definitely one of the cult favorites of the '80s. It's very raunchy, and it's an early Tom Hanks.
I've been curious as a Tom Hanks completist, but I've never gotten to that one. Yeah.
And then she was also in a couple of movies for Jim Wynorski. Did quite a bit of stuff, but she died in 1988 at age only 32 of heart disease. Oh. So it's another sad story of one of the cast of these films.
She's also in Scarface, and I think she's the woman that Stephen Bauer approaches and makes the eating out tongue gesture to, and gets smacked in the face.
Oh yeah,
still shocked that didn't work.
Yeah, it's funny to see a lot of these comedies when you have like a sexy little bit like that. There'll be some actress who's done bigger parts in smaller, exploitation films.
Yeah, and there's definitely, there's a bunch of little characters like that, and there's always like little moments, where you think you could see the thread of what they wanted to accomplish with this movie, and it just never quite comes together. Like, I thought the Bo Peep number was relatively funny. I think she's playing it like kind of an old school, like 1950s stripper performance, which is fun. Voice. Yeah, the Betty Boop voice, the big like, oh hey big boy kind of energy to it, it's just the movie can't really find the thread, and it's much more interested in spending time with these deeply unfunny male comedians. Like that doorman really does get a lot of screen time in this movie.
Yeah, they're very impressed with his humor, more so than anyone watching, I think.
And you can feel the Frank Pirelli influence in that. And Frank Pirelli does appear in both of these movies if you'd like to see him. He seems to be the same character, so I think he's
the Italian ambassador.
Yeah, he's the Agent Coulson of this universe. He's kind of connecting all of the different threads. Yeah.
He's the one who has Angelo Rosito as his little person sidekick, right?
Yes, from Freaks. Yeah.
From Freaks down to Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome and many others.
Right. Yes, he's Master. Oh, I forgot he was Master. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I feel like Cinderella was people kind of going, there's this trend now in movies, like, why don't we take a stab at it? But letting the idea kind of cook a little bit and working on the songs and the story. And I think, again, when you have one singular story to pull from, it's probably a little easier to stay focused. I think Fairy Tales to me is the one that feels more exploitative in terms of like, let's buck a trend.
Yeah.
Like, let's just get something out there. And it feels a lot less focused than Cinderella does. I think it feels more kind of quickly thrown together. And I think you might, it's weird that it was the second one in some ways, but also, like I said before, it kind of suffers from sequelitis a little bit.
Yeah.
And it also has Harry Hurwitz. He actually had kind of a double career. He did a movie called The Projectionist in the late 60s that's very highly regarded, and he's done some stuff that would be considered art films. And then he did this kind of B-movie stuff under the Harry Tampa pseudonym.
Yeah.
He teamed up after Fairy Tales with Nye Bonet, who plays Scheherazade in Fairy Tales, and they made a movie called Nocturna.
Right. Oh yeah, Nye Bonet was an interesting character. She's kind of one of the, at the time, she was the world's most famous belly dancer.
Yeah, she had a huge career as a belly dancer, and that's why they cast her as Scheherazade. She does the little dance in the movie, and then Nocturna was shot in New York, and it's about her playing Dracula's granddaughter, fleeing Transylvania with Dracula played by John Carradine coming after her.
Oh wow!
And that's another one that doesn't quite work. It's kind of trying to be a horror comedy, and it doesn't quite pull it off.
Yeah. We should also mention Harry Hurwitz, one of the writers of Under the Rainbow, the Chevy Chase, Carrie Fisher movie.
Which is now like the third time we've mentioned that movie on microphone for an episode. Like, I don't know why it keeps coming up so much.
I have no idea. That's just a fascinatingly terrible movie.
Yeah, that's one of those. I mean, we talk about the 80s as a great decade. There were so many terrible comedies in the early 80s.
There were so many.
Yeah, man.
And Harry Hurwitz also did a movie-making comedy called The Comeback Trail in 1982 that was recently remade with Robert De Niro and some other big names in it.
Oh yeah, Tommy Lee Jones is in that, I think. And like, yeah, that was a weird, like, kind of totally forgotten film. It just sort of like came to theaters and like, yeah.
I kept seeing trailers for it, and then COVID happened and it kept getting delayed, and I was never even aware that it actually came out. Like, there were posters for it everywhere for a few years, and it's all based on this little Harry Hurwitz movie from back in the early 70s.
And that movie, insane. I'm seeing here. I'm sorry. I'm totally falling down a wiki rabbit hole in real time. But that movie, written and directed by George Gallo, who wrote the script.
Oh yeah,
Midnight Run, one of the most perfect movies ever made. Like, so that's
talk about a perfect comedy script.
Yeah.
But sadly, when it comes to Gallo's career, that's kind of the exception that proves the rule.
It really kind of is. I don't know what happened. Yeah. Anyway,
but Harry, I'm trying to think if there are any other Harry Tampa movies we haven't mentioned.
Auditions was a big one for the early kind of sleazy era of that.
Oh yeah, we'll get to that eventually.
Yeah.
And, Harry Hurwitz died young too. He died at 57.
Oh wow, yeah. See, in 1995, he died. That's a shame. Interesting, it's a fascinating little time. It's a fascinating little group of people here. And I had a good time watching these, even if I couldn't fully wrap my head around what I was seeing. It's definitely a timepiece. It's definitely, if you want to see just absolutely one of the strangest moments in exploitation film history. You've got a trio of musical erotic comedies here that you can choose from that are singular, if nothing else.
Well, I would go so far. Oh, sorry, Michael. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, if you only watch one, watch Cinderella out of this
I think
trio.
so. Yeah.
I think it's a genuinely fun movie. I think it's not as kind of prurient or smutty or sleazy as the other ones are. And I think a lot of it does have to do with Rainbow Smith in the lead.
Yeah. And
yeah,
just
I would agree.
Better production value, better. Everybody seems a little bit more keyed into the tone of that movie.
Yeah, the other thing is that the sets in Fairy Tales look so cheap.
They look so
They're
cheap.
like 4 walls painted different colors and some dressing. And in Cinderella, you see that they probably did have, the $400,000 budget. Not on Fairy Tales, though.
Yeah.
Well, that's another thing about another knock on Fairy Tales is that I feel like there probably was the attitude of like, well, we spent $400,000 on Cinderella. We can probably do this cheaper.
Yeah.
And it was like, these are the places where we can cut corners. But I think the set design and production value and costuming and everything on Cinderella really kind of stands out. Like, I wholeheartedly recommend Cinderella. Like, I think I would tell listeners to definitely seek it out because it is such a perfect time capsule of an odd trend. Movies like that obviously don't really get made anymore. I mean, we're sort of moving into the direction of where sex scenes in movies are going to be gone entirely.
Yeah.
It seems like, but it's just, and I really, even though there's obviously a lot of smutty stuff and, sequences in the movie that are trying to build on the eroticism of the movie, I would love to see Cinderella in a theater. I would love to see it in like a repertory screening somewhere, introduced by someone, and just with a bunch of people who are going into it sort of blind, and just kind of read the reactions in the room. Like, that's a room I want to be in. And I think everyone should check it out.
So hopefully that print will be shown again at some point. I'd love to see it especially that beautiful print. I'd love to see it in the theater again too.
Yeah. I mean,
it took me the second viewing to get to this point. I was sort of in the beginning like, oof, boy, this was a lot, to watch. I watched the 2 movies back to back too. And I think that sort of made Fairy Tales more tiring also.
Yeah.
But the second time, my second viewing of Cinderella, it clicked. And I went, this is better. Not only is this better than Fairy Tales, but I can kind of pinpoint now where they're really successful. And I actually, now it is bumped up. It's not something I'm going to revisit often. No. I probably won't watch it again anytime soon unless it is a screening of some kind. But I think like anybody who's hearing this and is like, I never knew these movies existed. Definitely, if you're only going to watch one, go definitely watch Cinderella, not Fairy Tales.
Yeah.
Not Fairy Tales, yeah.
And you can take Sybil Shepherd on a date to this one. Maybe she won't walk out on you. We'll see. Well, thank you so much to Michael for being here. It was awesome to finally have you on the show. We've been wanting to have you on for so long, and you have such an incredible wealth of knowledge to share. So I really appreciate it. Where can people find all of your stuff and everything you've got going on?
I only have one social media. It's on Facebook, but I write regularly for Rue Morgue online and in the magazine for Fangoria magazine. I have a couple of books out, Ad Nauseum and Ad Astra, my collections of horror movie advertising and science fiction advertising from the 70s through the 90s. So yeah, my stuff is out there.
Amazing.
Ad Nauseum and Ad Astra, the 2 books, I have them both on my bookshelf in the living room, hardcover, 1984 publisher. Gorgeous books, absolutely gorgeous books. The perfect coffee table book for people who are genre movie fans. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's a shame. I thought after I did those that maybe someone else would go out and do a book on adult movie ads or something like that, some other collector, because I'm sure there's a lot of interesting stuff out there too.
Why not you? Why not you? You've got the market cornered on that.
Yeah, I don't have them in the collection, sadly.
Yeah.
Well, if you are a horror movie fan, I'm sure that you have loved Michael's writing at some point or his contributions to any number of horror documentaries that you've seen over the last probably 15 to 20 years. If you like what we do, then jump on to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, drop us a little 5-star rating, maybe a little review if you feel so inclined to do so. If you want to follow us on our social media, we're on Instagram at puppetmasters_Castle Freaks. You can follow me at _Giallo_Jerry or Steve at Minotaur Matador. You can also keep up with the show and hear audio versions of the show on YouTube, as well as finding out what we're doing on X and Threads and Blue Sky. Although we tend to not use those ones as much, but we are still there if that's where you choose to find us. But we're not the only show of Steve's that you should be trying to find. Steve, what else have you got going on?
Well, absolutely. I've got a show called Cinema Arcade. That's cinema and arcade mashed together into one glorious portmanteau. And that is the show where we are watching movies and then playing the video game adaptations of those movies so we can compare, contrast, see where they complement or differ from each other. We've had a lot of really fun stuff coming up. I'm about to record an episode tomorrow on the movie Surf Ninjas from 1993, a New Line kids classic with Leslie Nielsen as a cybernetic warlord. It's an insane movie. It's an insane game. And we just have a whole bunch of other stuff like that. Everything from The Wizard of Oz to Puppet Master, featuring one Mr. Jared Hornbeck. So check that out. And be sure to check us out next week because we have an episode coming up on a 1992 film called Spellcaster. This is a supernatural horror film starring a new wave rocker Adam Ant, starring in heavy air quotes. He's in it very little. Yeah. He's a heavy part of the marketing. It's a very campy, very fun movie. We've got some awesome guests on the show to talk about that one. Yeah. And so you'll want to check that out. Spellcaster. It will cast a spell on you.
Well, thank you again to Michael Gingold for joining us. Check out all of his writing on Rue Morgue or Fangoria or anywhere else if you just search his name. And we will see you guys back here next week for Spellcaster.